Good evening, my dear friends, those present and those online. As announced, our subject for consideration is the amazing history and future of the Jews. And one might say it couldn't have been more topical with the events of the last week or so. What we want to stress is that our address this evening is looking at what the Bible has to say. We don't give any opinions. We're looking at what the Bible has to say and comparing that with events that have transpired over the years and are projected as being in the near future. So, to begin our consideration, why is it amazing? Our subject is the amazing history and future of the Jews. Why is it amazing? The history of the Jews is amazing because it's unique. And we might ask the question, why is it unique? Well, it's unique because it's the only historical record which was written before the events took place. The complete history of the Jews was revealed in amazing detail before it happened, as we hope to demonstrate in a moment. So far as every other nation is concerned, they've only been able to record their history after the events have happened. So they're looking back on that which has happened, not rather that which will happen in the future. So, with regard to declaring the future, the prophet Isaiah had something to say in the 41st chapter of his prophecy, which was God speaking through the prophet. In Isaiah 41, verses 21 to 23, God challenges those that say that they worship gods as well. Produce your cause, saith the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. Let them bring them forth and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things what they be, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that ye are gods. So the challenge that God presents to anybody is to explain the past, why it happened the way it happened, and to explain the future, what is to happen, what is going to come to pass. And reading from the 43rd chapter of the prophecy of Isaiah, God said, well, I've got evidence that what I've said is coming to pass. That evidence is with the Jews. In Isaiah 43, verses 10 and 12, we read, God says, ye, the Jews, ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. So as we've summarized there at the bottom of the screen, the history of the nation of Israel was foretold accurately many years before the events began, which proves the existence of God and the fact that God is in control of events, that he can foretell exactly what is to take place step by step. And so we'd like to just have a look at that for a few moments. The complete history of the Jews as found in the Bible. And an amazing prophecy it is indeed. It's a history of the Jews taken from about BC 1600 right through to 1945, a period of 3,545 years, all spoken of in advance of the events of that long period. And the prophecy is found in the chapter of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, which we'd emphasize is written in round about BC 1,600 years. So what do we find if we look at that book? We don't intend to look at it at the moment. We'll look in more detail in a minute. But just to summarize, if we look at verses 25 to 36, it relates to the period before the Jews were conquered by the great Babylonian Empire. The next few verses, verses 37 to 45, describe the events of the captivity of the Jews under the Gentile powers. Verses 46 to 47 demonstrates how they became a curse as a sign and a wonder. Verses 48 to 52 describes the period where they were under Roman oppression, under the great Roman Empire. Verses 53 to 57 gets down to specifics, describing the horrors of a siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. Again, a reminder, these were written in BC 1600. It also goes on to describe in verses 58 to 64 the fact that the Jews would be scattered worldwide. And finally, verses 65 to 68 describe the distress in what became known as the Jews' diaspora, or the dispersal of the Jews throughout the nations of the earth. So that's a brief summary of the things that we can find if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 28. So our starting point is going back to the beginning of this chapter. In Deuteronomy 28 and verse 1, this is what God said to the nation of Israel through Moses when they were coming out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. It shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. So that's what God was going to do if they hearken to his voice. And so our starting point is when Israel became a nation, when they were called out of Egypt under Moses, in what is often referred to as the Exodus. They were given possession of a national homeland under conditions that were set by God that called them out. However, there's also the consequence of not obeying the voice of the Lord. And reading on in verses 15 and 25 of that same chapter, God says, it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, the Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Well, as history certainly graphically describes, sadly, Israel did not hearken to God. And the rest of the chapter, this Deuteronomy 28, the rest of the chapter foretold what was to become their history. Not what was their history, but what was to become their history in the centuries that followed. And that's what makes it so amazing as we look at it. We'd like to take a quotation from the Jewish Historical Atlas that was compiled by Martin Gilbert. And he said as follows, as my research into Jewish history progressed, I was surprised, depressed, and to some extent overwhelmed by the perpetual and irrational violence which pursued the Jews in every century and to almost every corner of the globe. If therefore persecution, expulsion, torture, humiliation, and mass murder haunt these pages, it is because they also haunt the Jewish story. So that's what we expect to find. That's a historian looking back, but this is what we expect to find as we move forward into the future from like 1600 BC. So just going into a little bit more detail now on those verses that we cited in Deuteronomy 28. We've cited the verses there, for example, verses 15 to 24, but it's a long chapter, so we picked out certain verses which summarize that group of verses. And in this particular case, we'd like to look at verse 20. The Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke in all that thou settest thine hand unto for to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me. So that's what God said would happen if they didn't regard the things that he commanded them. And moving on to verses 25 to 35, again picking two verses to summarize, verses 25 and 6. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth, and thy carcass shall be meat unto all fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth. Symbolic representation of nations, not literally fowls of the air and beasts of the earth. Well, the first part of the fulfillment of that was the fact that the Assyrian army conquered 10 of the tribes of Israel and dispersed them among the nations to avoid the possibility of rebellion. If they scattered them, they were not grouped together to rebel against the Assyrian power. So that was the policy of the Assyrians. And that took place. So far as the other two tribes were concerned, usually referred to as the kingdom of Judah, in Deuteronomy 28, verse 36, The Lord shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there shalt thou serve other gods, wood and stone. A significant aspect of this was that when we think of when these things were written, BC 1600, there's no prospect of a king. In fact, they'd not even entered the land at that point, the land of Canaan. It was only years afterwards, having been ruled over by judges, that Israel rebelled against God, and they decided they wanted a king like the kings of the nations. So this was distinctly a prophecy looking forward to a time when they would require a king. The Lord shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And that came to pass because, as the prophet Isaiah described, the last profane, wicked prince of Israel, the time had come when the kingdom was to be at an end because they refused point blank to obey the Lord their God. And so Zedekiah, the king of Judah at that time, when the Babylonians came, was captured by the Babylonians and carried away captive to Babylon along with his people. And so the kingdom came to an end, and Israel has never had a king since that time. So that was quite a remarkable prophecy, in that it foretold that Israel would desire a king, which, as we've already indicated, came to pass, and finished with Zedekiah, the last profane, wicked prince of Israel. Now, moving on, Israel suffered oppression under the Persian rule and then the Greek rule that followed the Babylonian. They were not set free after the Babylonian captivity of 70 years. And God said, "Thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb and a byword among all nations whither the Lord shall lead thee. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity." Again, a reminder, these things are written about 1600 years before Christ, speaking now of events that took place round about the year 400 BC or 300 BC, depending whether it's Persian or Greek. So despite being repatriated after 70 years in Babylon, Judah continued to suffer oppression under the successive powers of Persia and Greece. This was followed by a period under the Romans. And again, in Deuteronomy 28, verses 48 to 52, it describes that period. And we'll pick two verses, 49 and 52. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee. So there's the Roman symbol, the one that led their armies as they went into battle against the nations surrounding them. And God said this was a nation that he would bring against his people of Israel, again, because they would not hearken to his voice. Besiege thee in all thy gates until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest through all thy land. And so it came to pass. And in the days of the Lord Jesus, of course, they were under Roman rule. Well, next, in Deuteronomy 28, is described a gruesome time under the Romans. In verses 53 to 57, it describes that, but we'll just take two verses. And as we read, "The tender and delicate woman, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear. For she shall eat them for want of all things secretly, in the siege and straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in thy gates." That's a gruesome picture indeed. And in fact, Josephus, the historian, describes these events graphically as a historian looking back on what happened. And he describes exactly what is depicted here, how that the Roman soldiers came across a young woman eating her own child, and they were physically sick and unable to continue at that time. It's not something that you could anticipate, but it was anticipated because God was in control of events for the punishment of his people. They were scattered then, as the prophecy described. In verse 64, the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And any historical record of the world events will demonstrate quite clearly the extent of the Jewish diaspora, how extensive they are scattered amongst all the nations of the earth. Well, moving on, a very small detail perhaps, but the prophecy through Micah and the 3rd chapter records, therefore shall Zion for your sake be ploughed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of the forest. We might wonder why such a small amount of detail was given in the prophecy, but it's to demonstrate the accuracy of the prophecies about God's people of Israel. Because, as Gibbon wrote in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, after the final destruction of the temple by the arms of Titus and Hadrian, a ploughshare was drawn over the consecrated ground as a sign of perpetual interdiction. Zion was deserted. Yes, why would Gibbon record that small amount of detail? No doubt it was overruled by God as confirmation the prophecy through Micah was fulfilled in such detail. And so it was that we move on to the World War II, the time described there. Reading from verses 65 to 67, we read there, among these nations thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning, for the fear of thine heart, wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes, which thou shalt see. Any contact with a Jew that lived during that period in Europe, particularly in Germany, Poland, and so on, would testify to the fact that that was exactly the sentiments. We were familiar with one Jew who said, he remembered those words being said. They were terrified as to what was going to happen the next day as they tried to sleep. And in the day, they hid themselves away, terrified as to what might come to pass. And 6 million Jews were killed in the gas chambers throughout Europe, not just in Germany, but in various places of Europe. Well, it's not surprising with such a history that people ask the question, why? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 29, the following chapter, gives the explanation of exactly that in verses 24 to 28, where we read, even all nations shall say, wherefore hath the Lord done thus unto this land? What meaneth the heat of this great anger? Then men shall say, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they knew not and whom he had not given unto them. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land to bring upon it all the curses that are written in this book. And the Lord rooted them out of their land in anger and in wrath and in great indignation, and cast them into another land, as it is this day. Well, there's the explanation to the situation that has engulfed the Jews ever since those times in the prophecy. And so, as we indicated, Israel have never had a king over them since that time. We cited Ezekiel 21, but reading those words, God said through the prophet, I will overturn it, and it shall be no more until he come whose right it is, and I will give it him. So there is to be a kingdom of Israel in the future. God has appointed a day in which he will set a king over his people. He whose right it is, God says, I will give it him. And in the prophecy through Jeremiah chapter 30 and the 3rd verse, God says, I will bring again the captivity of my people, Israel and Judah, That's the 10 tribes and the 12 tribes, saith the Lord. And I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. Well, that is being fulfilled in our own day, as Israel have gone back to the land. Amazing sign of the times that we live in today. And so we come now to a more recent history of the Jews, although we've spoken about the Holocaust, which is fairly recent, but we want to come more up to date than that. The first aspect that we want to consider is the end of the desolation. And Jesus spoke words with regard to this in the Gospel record through Luke chapter 21, and reading verses 24 to 27. We summarize the important verse. Jesus said, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. If we were to go and visit the land 150 years ago, we'd find Palestine was under Turkish control. We'd find that the land was neglected and desolate. We'd find that there were very few Jews or Arabs in the land at that time. What we want to do, therefore, because it's so easy to say, well, this is what this prophecy means, this is what that prophecy means, and people will say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You're making things fit. What we'd like to do is to have a look at some things that is recorded in the Bible, and we can say that the Bible in its entirety was completed around about the year AD 96, how it anticipated future events. And the book Elpis Israel was written by a Bible reader, and that was completed in AD 1848. And the significance of using those two references is that the Bible, this is what the Bible says, and in Elpis Israel, this is what he expected. This is what he expected, despite the fact the events hadn't come to pass at that point, because the Bible said it. Well, the first aspect is that Israel were to be restored, and we've seen an indication of that in Jeremiah 30. But reading on in, again, Jeremiah 30 again, lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it, which we just read already, but confirmation. But then there's a significant point. The Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first. That's those that were taken into Babylonian captivity. That's in Zechariah chapter 12. And God says, I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it, and the cities shall be inhabited, and the wastes shall be builded. So in Elpis Israel, the writer said, there is then a partial and primary restoration of Jews before the manifestation. That is, before Jesus Christ actually returns. We notice also that in that next to the last paragraph, or the middle paragraph, I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel. And then it says, and the cities shall be inhabited, and the wastes shall be builded. It's an interesting expression, because we find a reference to the wastes that were to be builded. Looking at Ezekiel chapter 38, the prophet said, the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people, the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And Mark Twain, the author, Samuel Clemens, took a tour of Palestine in 1867, and this is his description of what he saw. A desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds. A silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. So that was what it was like in that time. An example of the change that took place. In 1909, a group of something like 100 Jews were gathered in what became Tel Aviv, and you can see how deserted that was and waste. 100 years later, they celebrated in 2009 the change that had taken place. That's before and after. Before Tel Aviv was built, but after Tel Aviv had been built on that same spot. Confirmation that the wastes were being built. Well, we might ask the question, how did this come about? Well, come back to God's promise. In the Bible we read, "But ye, O mountains of Israel, shall shoot forth your fruit to my people of Israel, for they are at hand to come. For behold, I am for you, and I will turn unto you, and ye shall be tilled and sown, and I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it, and the cities shall be inhabited, and the waste shall be builded." That's Ezekiel 36 again. And in Elpis Israel, it was written, "The pre-adventual colonization of Palestine will be on purely political principles. The Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the Messiahship of Jesus. They will emigrate thither as agriculturists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth." That was written in 1848. The pre-adventual colonization of Palestine will be on purely political principle, not religious, nothing connected with the Bible as far as they were concerned. It was purely on political principles. Well, how did that happen? Well, in Paris, there was an infamous trial of Captain Dreyfus, who was a Jew. But the trial was very much a false trial, as we might say. And in fact, so great was the injustice that was deemed to have been committed when he was jailed for treason, that the author wrote that heading in the French newspaper, he said, "I accuse." And he accused, a letter to the president, he accused the authorities of a fix in the trial against this man, Captain Dreyfus. He was court-martialed and jailed for treason, but then as a result of the protest, he later was retried and released. On political principles, we move on to the time of Theodore Herzl, who was a young reporter at the trial of Captain Dreyfus, and he was so appalled at the hatred of the Jews exhibited at the trial that he founded the Zionist movement to seek a home for the Jews. And in Elpis Israel, we could read, "The restoration of the Jews is a work of time and will require between 50 and 60 years to accomplish." That was written in 1848. It would take about 50 years. Well, Theodore Herzl, who established the Zionist movement, said that if he was to say out loud that it would be accomplished in 5 years or 50 years, he would be laughed at. But time would tell, and time indeed did tell, because 50 years later, or 51 years later, after the Zionist conference, the State of Israel was declared. It was 1897, the Zionist conference, and in 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Elpis Israel foretold that it would take 50 years. Theodore Herzl said the same thing. The scriptures were fulfilled in the restoration of the king of the people to the land. Well, moving on from there, how was that to be brought about? Well, in Elpis Israel, the writer said Britain would be compelled. He said, "I know not whether the men who at present contrive the foreign policy of Britain entertain the idea of assuming the sovereignty of the Holy Land and of promoting its colonization by the Jews. Their present intentions, however, are of no importance one way or the other." And he goes on to say that they will be compelled by events soon to happen to bring that about, that they will take on the custody of the land of Palestine and seek its repatriation. And that was accomplished by in the First World War by this man, Chaim Weizmann, who was a chemist at a time when Britain was struggling to get the supplies through, vital to the continuation of the population, and the German U-boats, the Unterseeboot, were devastating the fleet. And the difficulty was that nitrates required for the explosives that would remove the U-boat threat were not accessible. And so Weizmann invented an alternative. And as a result, in part payment, one might say, for what had happened, the Balfour Declaration was issued. And I'll just read you what that said. It was issued on November the 2nd, 1917, to a Jew. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on the declaration of sympathy. I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation, signed by Lord Balfour. Well, that was the Balfour Declaration, which firmly put Britain in the lead in seeking the repatriation of the Jews to the land. The prophet Isaiah went on to talk about a land shadowing with wings. And we read there in the scriptures, "Ho to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, saying, Go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled, a nation rooted and trodden down." It's interesting that it's an island power that's referred to there, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea. You don't do that unless you're an island power. And the prophecy points to Britain, as we'll see indicated in a moment. So that's the region of the rivers, the Euphrates, and the land shadowing with wings is from the tips. You can see there from Britain on the one side to India, where Britain had great interests at that time. To Britain, then, the prophet calls as the protector of the Jewish nation. And so that's exactly what was said in Elpis Israel, that Britain would take that responsibility of bringing about the repatriation of the Jews. Again, moving on to the time when this was to be brought about, the prophet said he lifteth up an ensign. The colours are a bit pale on there, I don't know if you can see them, but the boundary in red was the Palestinian mandate granted to Britain at the San Remo Conference in 1920 as the region of a Jewish national home. However, that was reduced to the area to the left, or put it another way, it was reduced to a land without all that in green to the right, which is modern-day Israel, I suppose, more or less. But that was actually separated from Palestine by Britain in 1924 and given to Emir Abdullah and named Transjordan. It was closed to Jewish settlements. So that divided the land from what was deemed to be a fair distribution between the Arabs and the Israelis. The next step on that was the lifting up of the ensign. Israel was reborn. On the 14th of May, 1948, Ben-Gurion stood up at the Knesset and declared the existence of the State of Israel. As the Palestine Post said, the State of Israel is born. The prophet says, "See when he lifteth up an ensign upon the mountains," and the flag of Israel was designed and became the symbol of that reborn nation in 1948. But more than that, the scriptures went on to describe in detail, Jesus did, said Jerusalem should be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. What emotional scenes there were in June 1967, the famous Six-Day War, when Israel finally recaptured Jerusalem, the ancient capital, during that time. And there's quite a famous photograph of emotional Israeli soldiers overcome by the recapture of their ancient capital. That was foretold in about AD 32 by Jesus, and it became history in AD 1967. One thing that the scriptures do declare in a number of prophecies is that a perpetual hatred exists between the Arabs and the Jews. We say these are not personal comments. These are what the Bible has to say, and we just note and see whether they came to pass or not. The perpetual hatred in Psalm 83, the psalmist said, they have said, and it can be seen that it refers to Arab nations. The nations are listed in Psalm 83. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And that was foretold approximately 3,200 years ago. Now it's amazing to see how things have developed. Look at Israel in today's news, and we have come right up to date now. The first heading was about the Hamas terrorism, which occurred on Saturday, the 6th of October, reported on the 7th of October in the Sunday Telegraph. And then it went on to say a few days later how that Hamas had massacred babies and children. The paper also said, this is the most difficult image we've ever posted. As we were writing this, we were shaking. We went back and forth about posting this, but we need each and every one of you to know this happened, actually happened. That was Friday the 13th of October, so we're almost up to date. These are headlines out of the daily newspapers. And finally, today, this very, very day, the Daily Telegraph carried an article headed, Iran's plan to destroy Israel. Yes, Iran's plan to destroy Israel. Well, what of the future of the Jews? The Bible goes on to say more. And if we turn to Zechariah chapter 14, the climax of events is described. And we can relate these to what's happening now, actually. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. And then it goes on to say in verse 3, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. And finally, the 9th verse of Zechariah 14, the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one. So this is to be the end result. We've not gone into details of what is to happen in the future, particularly because that's still to be revealed, apart from what the Bible has to say. We've spent more time on what's happened previously to demonstrate that the Bible testified in advance what has happened over the last 3,500 years. Well, the final end to war is envisaged. In Isaiah chapter 2, the prophet records, many people shall go and say, come here and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Again, moving on to verse 4. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. That is a prospect for Israel and for all the other nations too, in the day when God intervenes in world affairs. We talked about amazing prophecies. If we take the history of the Jews as recorded from BC 1600 to 1967, firstly, Israel's theocracy would become a kingdom, which it was in BC 1000. The Babylonians would conquer the Jews, which they did in BC 612. Jerusalem would be subject to a horrific siege, which it was in AD 70. The Jews will be scattered worldwide, which they were after that, during which Jerusalem will be ploughed as a field, as we've seen. The Jews will be regathered to their land from the year AD 1900 onwards. That has been taking place. And Israel will become a nation again, which they did in 1948. And Jerusalem will be restored to the Jews, which it was in 1967. And all of that was called from Bible prophecy. Nothing that we've invented. It's all there for all to see. That these are events that the Bible foretold would come to pass. Well, in conclusion then, why are we telling you all this? We're telling you all this because we believe it is proof that God exists and is working to a revealed plan for the earth. Also, God is shortly to send Jesus Christ back to the earth to judge the world in righteousness and to establish world peace. And finally, personally, we want to share the wonderful news with you that God has promised everlasting life in that transformed world to all that believe in the gospel. Thank you.